which is the background for today's talk. A couple of you may recognize one or two familiar images in here that I do use in that course as well. And maybe when we come to the end of the talk today, I'm always happy to advertise the really diverse and engaging array of courses that auditors can take in the history department in Middle East history, as well as lots of other fields. As Paul said, we'll have at least 15-20 minutes for questions at the end. But I think what I'll do, especially since we're a nice small group today, is I'll pause at least once or twice earlier in the talk to collect any questions that you might have up to that point. It's a little hard for me in Zoom, even after a year of teaching this way, to kind of monitor questions that come up spontaneously, but I'll definitely pause, more than once during the talk for questions that have come that arise for you up to that point. So here we are. It's 10 years since the Arab Spring uprisings of 2011. Paul and I were talking about the topic for this talk, and he said, he said to me, I feel like we're all really paying very close attention to what was happening in the Middle East for a while, and then a lot of us kind of just lost track, right, to one degree or another. And I think that's true, and it's understandable, especially in the year of COVID-19, when we've all had a lot to think about closer to home. To some extent, probably the drama of American politics since 2016 also kind of drove foreign affairs out of the American news cycle even more than usual, perhaps. And so I think it's appropriate that, a decade since this kind of cataclysmic event shook the region of the Middle East, that we take stock and do a bit of review of what actually happened 10 years ago, what's happened since then, and what can we say about it with a little bit of historical distance, try to understand how has the region actually changed since 2011? How has it not changed, right? And how can we put together a bit of a framework for understanding current events and events that might unfold in the future? So that's our agenda for today. So I know that this will be familiar to some of you who regularly spend time in the Middle East and have friends there or follow the news there quite closely. But since it has been a decade, and some of us, I'm sure, have not been following the Middle East news, very closely, I think it's worth taking some time just to review what do we mean when we talk about the Arab Spring? What happened 10 years ago that represents a rupture in the political history of the region up to that point. And I'm going to try to slow myself down a little bit as I see we have the live transcript going. So as you may recall, the Arab Spring uprisings began with a spark in Tunisia, in the North African country of Tunisia, when the man pictured on the right here, an ordinary Tunisian citizen, Mohamed Bouazizi, performed a striking and tragic act of protest, self-immolating, lighting himself on fire in the streets to protest his treatment at the hands of a local security official. He was a kind of street vendor who had suffered a kind of routine form of humiliation at the hands of the local authorities and lit himself aflame as an act of protest. That act turned Tunisians out into the streets, and you can see them here holding his image, referring to him in Arabic as Shahid al-Karama wal-Hurriya, a martyr of honor and freedom. And those protests drove from power the longtime Tunisian president, Zain al-Abidine Ben Ali, who had been in office since 1987 and resigned after just a couple weeks of these mass protests in January 2011. That protest movement and its kind of lightning quick success created a moment of possibility when the enduring authoritarian regimes that were present across North Africa and much of the Middle East suddenly seemed vulnerable in a way that was new. And so it's in that sense which Ben Ali's resignation in Tunisia created the moment of possibility, if not the direct impetus, for the next major uprising that really took this revolutionary moment to the next level and started to generate talk of a regional phenomenon, right? In other words, not just a Tunisian uprising, but something kind of carrying across the Middle East. Egypt's January 25th revolution was a mass protest movement beginning on January 25th, which was meant to be kind of on the public calendar a day honoring the country's police forces, and dissenting groups, many of them youth-led, many of them organized, though not exclusively organized, on new social media, instead took this day as an opportunity to protest against police violence and state security violence. That uprising, most iconically centered on Cairo's downtown Tahrir Square, pictured here, right, carried on for several weeks, occupying major Egyptian public spaces until the longtime President Hosni Mubarak, who had been in power for 30 years, also resigned. The period between February and March 2011 was really a pivotal point for transforming these kind of national protest movements into a recognizable regional phenomenon. So President Mubarak resigned in Egypt in early February 2011. Also in these months, civil war broke out in Libya, which would soon drive the longtime autocratic Muammar al-Gaddafi from power. Mass protest also began in Syria in March of 2011. So by the kind of early spring of 2011, we had seen longtime presidents resign in Tunisia and Egypt, and mass protest movement and or civil war in Libya and Syria. And this is when people really start to talk about an Arab, quote unquote, an Arab Spring as it becomes a regional phenomenon. Now, in retrospect, I think it's worth asking, to what extent was this actually a coherent regional phenomenon? Did these different protest movements actually have meaningful commonalities? They had simultaneity, right? And there was clearly a way in which one movement drew inspiration from another movement, such as the Tunisian uprising. But that doesn't necessarily mean, right, that these movements actually had a lot in common. We can, however, and I think, again, some historical distance now, helps us in analyzing these movements. We can identify some common factors which help us understand these disparate uprisings in 2011 as, to some degree, a single coherent phenomenon. So to begin with, the Arab Spring uprisings were very much revolts against a certain political order. In particular, these were uprisings against enduring authoritarian regimes in the Arab republics. Okay, so it's significant that at least the most successful or the most powerful uprisings that we see in 2011, right, are those that occur in a particular kind of state in the Middle East, which are the Arab republics that emerge in the era of decolonization in the mid-20th century, and which put in place a political order that is constitutional and republican by law, but which turns out in most cases to be autocratic in practice. So these are all revolts against people who one prominent Middle East historian once called presidents for life, right? Like people like Hosni Mubarak, who took office in 1981 and was still in power at the beginning of 2011. People like Zine El Abidine Ben Ali in Tunisia, who had been in office since 1987. Muammar al-Gaddafi in Libya, in office since 1969. In Syria, Bashar al-Assad had only been in power since the year 2000, but he had inherited power from his father, Hafez al-Assad, who had been in power since the 1970s. Likewise, in Yemen, you had President Ali Abdullah Saleh facing a popular uprising. He had been in office since 1990. So these are all uprising against these kind of president for life figures who exist in the Arab republics. Right? We see less of this mass political mobilization in the monarchy states, right, in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Jordan in particular, for reasons having to do with the different basis of political legitimacy and the political order in those countries. These are very much uprisings against the idea that the constitutional order, right, in these Arab republics had been corrupted, particularly as these longtime presidents start to move to pass power on to their sons, right? So Bashar al-Assad in Syria, we had Hosni Mubarak starting to engineer a succession for his son, Gamal Mubarak, in Egypt. These were also very much revolts against the excesses, perceived excesses, of state security services in these countries, right? So you see on the right here a picture of a young man named Khalid Said, who was an Egyptian youth who was brutally murdered by Egyptian security officers, which happened to be captured in images that circulated. His mutilated, very kind of graphically mutilated body, images of his body were circulated online, particularly on Facebook groups in 2010, right? And you see here Egyptian protesters holding up a sign saying, you know, your blood is not cheap, O Khalid, right? So these were very much, many of these movements shared the common cause of protesting the violence of the security services, which perpetuated the rule of these presidents for life. Right? The other common factor which we can see in many of these movements is that these were movements without kind of clear ideological leadership. In other words, you know, some of you, I'm sure, remember the Iranian Revolution of 1978, 1979, right, and the overthrow of the ruling Shah of Iran at that time, right? And it was very clear in the Iranian Revolution in the 70s that this was a movement of organized, pre-existing organized opposition, right, to the Shah, right? Actually, several political movements that opposed the Shah, but most prominently, right, the one led by Ayatollah Khomeini, right, and it's no coincidence, right, that in the wake of the Iranian Revolution, you have the establishment, ultimately, of the Islamic Republic of Iran, right, because it was, right, to a large degree, a kind of ideologically led revolution. By contrast, right, in the case of the Arab Spring uprisings, we have a situation that one prominent Middle East sociologist has described as revolution without revolutionaries. In other words, these were more spontaneous uprisings, more decentralized or diffuse in the way that they were led, right? They had certain shared negative objectives, right, in the sense that they wanted to overthrow an existing political order. They wanted to put an end to the abuses of the state security services, but they did not have a clear kind of positive ideological agenda, be it, you know, a liberal agenda, a socialist agenda, an Islamist agenda, right? There was no clear ideological or recognizable ideology that brought the revolutionaries together. This was a strength in the revolutionary moment in that it allowed citizens to bracket, right, the political differences that they had, right, in the kind of common cause of overthrowing an order that they despised. Right? But in the long term, as we'll see, this also proved to be a weakness in the sense, or a limitation, in the sense that these uprisings lacked a coherent, many of them lacked a coherent vision of what they wanted to replace the order that they were overthrowing. The other interesting common feature that we see in many of the Arab Spring uprisings, particularly most famously in Egypt, is the use of social media, which is just at this point in 2011, a bit earlier as well, actually becoming a major tool for political organization, especially the organization of dissent and opposition. And this, I think, is part of the context which enables this revolution without revolutionaries, right? And this kind of non-ideological and non-partisan quality to the uprisings, right? Because what social media does in this moment is it allows, right, people to come into the streets in an organized way without the kind of pre-existing infrastructure of political parties and kind of organized opposition, right? It also allows for things like citizen journalism, right? People who are not trained journalists and are not professional journalists, right, to take pictures of a police, abuse, right, and to circulate it widely, right, to broadcast images of protests across the world, right, and so forth. And so this is another common feature. And I think, together these common features do allow us to speak of a coherent regional moment in the spring of 2011, despite the different local causes and circumstances, right, of each uprising. I think it is justifiable in retrospect to say that there were certain common features which made this a coherent phenomenon. Let me say one other thing briefly before I pause for a kind of first round of questions. Iran and Turkey were different. So there are these other kind of mass protest movements around the same time in other Middle East countries, particularly the Green Movement in Iran in 2009, a bit earlier than the Arab Spring, and the Gezi Park protests, which you may remember in Turkey in 2013. And although, we can certainly make connections between these protest movements and the Arab Spring, I would set these aside as, being more different than alike. Primarily because it's just a very different political context. Iran and Turkey both feature highly competitive electoral politics, which is not to say that they're kind of fully functioning democracies, but they do feature highly competitive electoral politics. And these protest movements, the Green Movement in Iran, the Gezi Park movement in Turkey, were shaped by the pre-existing divisions within each country's electoral politics. So you may remember that Iran's Green Movement was a protest against the outcome of a presidential election in that year, which was widely believed to have been rigged in favor of the incumbent, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Perhaps you remember him. In Turkey, the Gezi protests, which are pictured on the right here, expressed the kind of pent-up discontent that a portion of Turkish society, especially kind of urban society in Turkey's west, felt toward the rule of the Justice and Development Party and its Prime Minister, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who at that point had been in power for a decade. So all of this is to say that I think the causes of dissent and the organization of protests were substantially different in Iran and Turkey, where you had functioning partisan elections. And of course, these are also not Arab countries. So for that reason as well, it makes sense to leave them out of the Arab Spring phenomenon. But ethnicity is not really the key factor in understanding the Arab Spring as a shared phenomenon. And I think it's not really
Good morning, Tim.
I think someone is not.
Good. What do you know? Oh, okay, great.
So all of that is just to say that I think it makes sense to set Iran and Turkey aside and think of the Arab uprisings as a coherent phenomenon on their own terms. Let me pause here for a moment just to collect questions that have arisen so far, and then I'll move into the second half of the talk to talk about kind of how things went awry in various ways and to try to explain some of the divergent outcomes that we see in different countries since 2011.
Paul, can I ask a question?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, go ahead. And we could, Dan, do you want to switch to gallery view
sure.
for a minute? All right.
My question has to do with the security forces or the police forces in each or some of the countries, how much of their policing or their security ideas were given to them by the leader, and how much autonomy did the head of the forces have? I'm just curious.
Right, and the particular way in which the security forces are organized turns out to be an important factor in the outcome of some of these uprisings, and it differs a bit in each country. So in Syria, for example, there was a very complex, right, way in which the Assad regime, going back to Hafez al-Assad in the 1970s and his efforts to kind of prevent a military coup, right, such as the one that had brought him to power, right? So the security state in Syria develops in a way which is meant to tie kind of special security forces very closely to the ruling family, right? So you have members of the Assad family, right, actually in charge of kind of special battalions, right, that are kind of layered on top of the regular army. There's also a sectarian quality to the organization of the army and the security services in Syria, where members of the Alawite minority, right, from which the Assad family comes, right, were also kind of placed in privileged positions in kind of, particularly in the more heavily armed security units, right? The idea being that the regime couldn't really rely on the loyalty of the regular army, right? But it created this kind of additional layer of units, right, that were personally tied to the regime. That's less the case in Egypt, where the regime itself, is tied to the army, and in the sense that Mubarak himself was a prominent Air Force officer and comes out of a kind of series of military officers who held power in Egypt since the 1952 revolution in Egypt. But there was much less of that kind of elaborate layering of kind of security services that were meant to kind of watch each other and prevent the possibility of a coup. In part because Egypt didn't have that sectarian dynamic in the organization of politics or of the army. I'm going into detail here a little bit because this is something I was going to talk about anyway, actually, because I think it's an important factor in thinking about how things turn out a bit differently in different countries, why Syria winds up in a protracted civil war and Egypt doesn't, for example. But one other thing I would say just briefly is, it's very much, when we talk about the security services, these are countries with many security services, right? At the time, right? And it's not as though it's just like, the police, the way we would think of, there being local police, right? And maybe, a federal police service. There are these kind of layers of security services that keep watch on dissent and, are deployed in the streets when there are protests and so forth. I see there's another question.
Professor, you haven't mentioned United States foreign policy yet. Here's my question. Barack Obama goes to Cairo, makes a pro-democracy speech, which apparently at the moment is widely and positively received, at least by that audience. And yet all of this eventually pretty much fails. My question is, could and should the United States have done more, or what was the limit of our actual foreign and military power and influence in these events?
Yeah, I promise I didn't plant these questions, but they are very much kind of leading me towards the things I'm planning to talk about. In any event, I think foreign intervention or the absence of foreign intervention is another really decisive factor between 2011 and 2016 or so. And, you know, the US is just one country with interests and the potential to affect the course of events. I think it's hard to imagine the US doing less, right, than it did to support the democracy movements in the Middle East. I think Libya is really the only case where you see, certainly the only case where you see US or US-led intervention, right, in support of a democracy, or at least a kind of anti-authoritarian movement in that country. But in most cases, right, both under the Obama administration, right, and you know, in subsequent years, the U.S. policy has been either kind of silent or, in some cases, kind of actively perpetuated, you know, the kind of factional civil wars that have prevented a more positive outcome in the region. We'll talk a bit about the reasons for that. I mean, I think the Obama administration, what I talk about with my students, at least the undergraduates at the university, you know, we kind of interpret I think it makes sense to interpret the Obama administration's reluctance to get involved in these uprisings in the context of the US war in Iraq, right? I mean, as you all recall, right, that, you know, President Obama was elected as someone who was against quote unquote dumb wars or stupid wars? I always forget if it was, right? He famously said he was not against wars, he was against dumb wars, right? Which the Iraq war was in his judgment. And so, was it stupid wars? I forget, it was stupid, yeah. So, so, you know, he came to office, you know, with very little appetite. And I think, you know, the US electorate had very little appetite for a kind of intervention in Middle East politics, particularly one where there wasn't, you know, a clear, you know, it wasn't like there was a clear US defense interest, let's say. And so, you know, he gave this speech, you know, in the weeks during the Tahrir Square uprising, you know, in late January, or maybe it was the first week of February. And it was this very, you know, kind of measured speech saying that, you know, the people of Egypt would decide their fate essentially and should decide their fate, but you know, very carefully declining to call for Mubarak to resign or anything like that. And I think, you know, that reflected the longstanding alliance between the Egyptian army and, you know, the US government going back to the late Cold War, going back to the 1970s and then the peace with Israel. But it also, I think, reflected Obama's particular kind of lack of appetite for Middle East politics. And we see that in Syria as well, right? All right, shall we move on? We're going to talk more about these factors anyway. Paul?
Yeah. Question maybe from the chat room we had. Did these
Oh.
resolutions pose any opportunity for peaceful relations with Israel?
Yeah.
And what was Israel's concerns with these uprisings, revolution?
Right, yeah, I think that, you know, the Netanyahu government, I think for the most part, regarded and has regarded the uprisings in the Middle East with a great deal of caution and concern, right? So in Egypt's case, you know, there was a cold peace, right, but a strategically important peace, right, from the Israeli perspective with the Mubarak government. And particularly as, you know, the Muslim Brotherhood came to power after Mubarak's resignation, there was concern, right, about how that might empower Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Likewise, the Syrian civil war, right, became an occasion for much greater Iranian military presence and involvement in Syria, right, and that too, I think was a cause of great strategic concern for the Netanyahu government. So you know, not that they enjoyed, you know, the friendliest of relations with the pre-existing regimes along their borders, but I think they tended to have tended to view the uprisings through the kind of the strategic lens of stability, right, and the enemy you know being preferable to the enemy you don't. I think that to the extent that there has been an opportunity here from an Israeli perspective. We see it like with the move towards détente with Saudi Arabia and some of the Gulf states, right? In as much as, you know, the Iranian involvement in Syria and in some of the other Iranian intervention in some of the other conflicts that emerged since 2011 in the region, particularly in Yemen, where Iran has supported one faction in the civil war there. That has kind of led some of the Arab states, particularly Saudi Arabia, you know, whose government, you know, has a longstanding kind of Cold War with Iran since the Iranian Revolution, right, to kind of have their backs against the wall and be looking to strengthen their strategic relationships with the U.S. and also with Israel. So I think we can see, you know, the closer relationships between Saudi Arabia, the UAE, right, Kuwait, right, and Israel, right, as maybe a long-term consequence of the Arab Spring, albeit an indirect one, I would say, as a response to kind of the increasing Iranian influence in the region. I think we're going to be able to skip ahead a bit since I've answered some, or I've addressed some points that I was going to address anyway. Right, so, you know, since 2011, the kind of general media narrative that I think you may have encountered is that the Arab Spring was largely a failure, right, and became a kind of Arab winter, right? And that narrative emerges especially in response to the outcome in Syria, where mass protest in 2011 very quickly turns into civil war as the army fractures, right? And you have the formation of the Free Syrian Army in the summer of 2011, loyalist units, right, joined by Hezbollah units from Lebanon and Iran, supported by Iranian Revolutionary Guard support as well, right? Eventually the rise of ISIS in the country's east, Kurdish groups, armed groups in the country's north, right? Syria basically breaks apart between 2011 and 2016. You also have the return of civil war in Libya in 2014, which lasted until last year, a protracted conflict developing in Yemen as well. But I think it's especially the really bloody and disastrous humanitarian consequences of the Syrian civil war that kind of create this narrative of a failure of the Arab Spring as the Assad regime holds on to power. Also notable in terms of this idea of Arab Spring failure is the counter-revolution that Egypt experiences in the summer of 2013, when the government of Mohamed Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood candidate who was elected in 2012, was deposed by the Egyptian armed forces in response to a kind of mass movement of dissatisfaction with Morsi's rule. We'll talk about that in a moment. Right. In all of this, Tunisia, the original Arab Spring country, remained an interesting and remains an interesting exception, where you do have a functioning parliamentary democracy. In thinking about these outcomes, I do think that foreign intervention is really important to think about. The balance of foreign intervention in response to the Arab uprisings, right, was really to forestall and preclude you know, the possibility of democratization. This is dramatically the case in Syria, where you have Iranian support of the Assad regime and also, and even more decisively, Russian support coming in and really turning the tide in 2016. That Russian intervention was putatively, you know, targeted against the Islamic State, which had emerged in eastern Syria, but quite decisively turned the tide against the Free Syrian Army as well. Russian intervention, I think, got a lot of attention in Western media. But, you know, it's also very much the case that Middle East countries have intervened in each other's politics, right? And used military force to intervene against uprisings in neighboring countries. So Iran has done this, right, in Syria. But Saudi Arabia has also been a major counter-revolutionary force in the region. What you see here on the right are Saudi units deploying against a mass protest movement in Bahrain in 2011, Bahrain, for those who are not quite sure, is on the map here, right, where the red dot is. It is in the Persian Gulf, but connected to eastern Saudi Arabia by causeway. And you see the Saudi troops actually kind of moving across that land bridge to put down a protest movement centered in Bahrain's Shiite majority community. And Saudi Arabia for many years has been concerned, right, about the possibility of Shiite political mobilization in its own eastern region, right, seeing that population as a kind of potential fifth column or a kind of extension of Iranian influence into Saudi politics. So Saudi Arabia, right, it's not just kind of outside powers like the US or Russia, right, which have been kind of intervening. Saudi Arabia has been a major counter-revolutionary force, Iran as well, and Iran and Saudi Arabia remain locked in a kind of proxy war that has split the Yemeni Republic for several years now, right, in the aftermath of the resignation of the longtime president, Ali Abdullah Saleh, in that country. So really the only case in which outside intervention has supported democratization was the Libyan case in 2011. The other thing, and I alluded to this earlier in thinking about why the Arab Spring turned out to have such limited consequences in terms of or positive consequences in terms of democratization, has to do with the limited nature of the uprisings themselves, right? And we see this particularly in the Egyptian case. As I said earlier, right, these were revolutions without revolutionaries, right? The students and workers, right, and others, right, who poured into the streets in 2011 did not have they did not share an ideological agenda, right, except that they wanted to overthrow, right, the regime, right? But that meant that once the regime had fallen, right, the replacement, right, for that vacuum, right, was something that that was not clear. And in that context, right, so in Egypt's case, right, what happens is that the most organized opposition movement in Egypt winds up being the movement which is best positioned to win the elections that are held in 2012. That movement is the Islamist party, the Muslim Brotherhood, which, despite being the best organized kind of opposition in the country, right, really only enjoyed the backing of a kind of faction of Egyptian society, at most a very slim majority, right? And it's the efforts of that government, the Brotherhood government in 2012, to kind of put its stamp on the new constitution that had to be written at that time, which kind of provoke a kind of splintering of Egyptian society, a turning of the revolution against itself, right? So you see here kind of supporters of different Egyptian parties taking to the streets and literally, you know, throwing things at each other in late 2012, right? Unable to agree, right, on how to write a new constitution and whether this new Muslim Brotherhood-led elected government, right, had the right to kind of write the constitution that it wanted. And that's the context, right, for eventual military intervention in Egypt in 2013 to depose the elected government, right? And the leader of that coup, Abdel Fattah Sisi, right, of course, remains Egypt's president to this day, 8 years later. There's very little sign that he will lose power anytime soon. I want to close by saying that despite the real limitations of the Arab Spring uprisings in the long term, and the fact that we have this narrative of Arab Spring failure, which has more than a grain of truth to it, there's still, I think, some real ways in which the region remains transformed by what happened in 2011, and there remain as well reasons for optimism. So to begin where I left off in Egypt, right? On the one hand, the Sisi regime in Egypt since 2013, right, has imposed, certain kinds of, or resorted to certain kinds of authoritarian tactics that, had not previously been seen in Egypt, at least since the 1970s, right? And you have a degree of press censorship in particular in Egypt today, which was not characteristic of the Mubarak era government, certainly in its later years. But by the same token, I think what that augurs, or what that indicates, right, is that there is in Egypt, right, even to this day, actually a much more vibrant kind of politics of dissent and of empowerment, right, than existed, right, say, at the beginning of the 21st century, when there was this kind of resignation, this feeling that nothing could be done. It was the way it was, right? Mubarak was Mubarak, and so it goes, right? Malash, as they would say in Egypt, right? Right, I think to give a positive spin to the authoritarian situation, which we see in Egypt today, right? I mean, there is this way in which, right, the tactics of press censorship and the cracking down on dissent under the Sisi government, right, indicates the fact that there is still this kind of bubbling, kind of turbulence to Egyptian political life, which you know, is suppressed at the moment, but which remains empowered, right? And there isn't the kind of fatalistic sense, right? It's also important to say that the Sisi government enjoys a large degree of popular support for having restored a sense of kind of public order and the possibility of kind of regular economic life, and at least until the COVID-19 pandemic set in. The other thing I want to just draw your attention to very briefly, and especially because I think it's been a bit overlooked in the American press due to the pandemic and other factors, but there has been a wave of really interesting popular movements in the Middle East since 2019. So since 2019, we've seen protest movements dislodge the President Bouteflika in Algeria, who had been in office for almost 30 years. We've seen major protests in Iraq in 2019 against the kind of post-war political order in that country. And most recently, and in some ways most interestingly, we've seen a protest movement in Lebanon, pictured here on the right. Lebanon's October Revolution that began in 2019, sometimes called the WhatsApp uprising, because it was provoked by the decision of the government to raise revenue in Lebanon by imposing a surcharge on daily use of the app WhatsApp, which some of you may use. It's like a texting and phone app used, especially it's more popular outside the United States, but it works really well for international calls. It's end-to-end encrypted. It's a kind of Facebook Messenger sort of app. So that uprising was initially provoked by that surcharge, but has since then kind of spiraled into a kind of mass movement against the whole kind of political order that emerged in Lebanon at the end of that country's civil war in the early 1990s. You know, at one point, you know, estimates were something like 1/3 of the country had taken to the streets in support of this revolutionary movement, which is a kind of astonishing thing to imagine if you translate that into American terms, right? And, you know, the Lebanese uprising is very much a local kind of thing in the sense that it, you know, is protesting circumstances that are particular to that country's politics and especially its economy. You know, the Lebanese currency has lost about 60% of its value, you know, in dollar terms since 2019, which has made, you know, ordinary Lebanese people unable to afford, you know, any sort of imported goods, not just luxury goods, but any sort of imported goods, unable also to access bank savings due to capital controls imposed because of the currency crisis. It's also very much a country with a long-term budgetary crisis due to the burden of debt service in Lebanon, which has spent something like 1/3 of its public budget on debt service since the early 1990s. So Lebanese citizens have had to live with kind of dilapidated and unequally distributed infrastructure for decades. It's not uncommon for people in Lebanon to have like 2 electric companies, right, that they pay their utility bills to, like the public utility and then like their actual electric company that provides them the most of the electricity that they need. So this is an uprising against the failure of the political parties which have governed Lebanon since the 1990s to provide for kind of basic economic needs and against also the growing inequality of the distribution of economic resources in that country. So again, right, we don't want to lose sight of kind of the way in which these uprisings are locally situated and motivated by, particular local concerns. But I do think it's worth thinking about whether we're in a kind of second Arab Spring moment since 2019, despite the way in which the pandemic has maybe eclipsed what's happening, right, and made it more difficult for us to see or certainly to pay attention to, right. I think there's a lot going on in the Middle East which is worth following right now, and the Lebanon movement is maybe the most interesting. I want to cut myself short there to say thank you and to open some more time for questions. My email is on the screen if you would like to follow up by email with questions or to discuss opportunities in the history department at UW-Madison. We have a lot of courses, not just Middle East courses, that welcome senior auditors every semester, including online this year. Not sure how we're doing it next year yet, but we'll always have courses that are open to senior auditors. We also have a new history club, which does different kinds of outreach programs for people interested in history in the Madison community. So please feel free to email me with questions about that as well. And thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. Okay, we have some time for questions, and if we want to.
Thank you, Dan. Nice job. This is Roz.
Hi, Roz.
I have a question. So spinning off that last photo with the women so prominent, can you just say a little bit about the role of women in these revolutions and the aftermath?
Absolutely, and I selected images that featured, the prominent role of women, including many young women, deliberately, even though, because I wasn't going to have time to talk about it specifically, but I think that is a real feature of these uprisings. In some ways, it's not that surprising. I mean, women have been, participated in public protest movements in the Middle East, at least since the 1919 revolution in Egypt. I think that, and in some cases, and here I'm thinking of Iran in particular, actually, women have kind of been in the fore of popular protest movements precisely because of at least the perception that they would be less likely to be subjected to violence, right? Not less likely to be subjected to violence in private, right? Where we do have, serious issues of sexual violence being deployed as a tactic by state security services when women are taken into custody during these protest movements. But at least in public, right, where you have the use of social media, right, and everything is being kind of captured on video and on screen and being circulated almost instantly. In some cases, women have kind of marched in the front, in the idea that they would be less likely to be attacked by the security services. But I don't think it's surprising to see kind of a mass kind of mobilization of women in public, really in any of these countries, unless it were to happen in Saudi Arabia, because as I say, there is actually quite a long history of it. Yes.
Let's look forward, Daniel. If Tony Blinken was to call you and say, Daniel, I want to appoint you as United States ambassador to the Middle East in some way, what do you think going forward our foreign policy position ought to be that would strengthen our interests there and our objectives there? What should we as a country be doing in the Middle East, and how should we implement
I think I'd be unlikely to take the job. But, but that being said, I mean, I think that, look, I've taken mostly a regional approach today, because I do think it makes sense to think of these uprisings in somewhat common terms. But when it comes to like a US foreign policy approach, I would tend to think that a more like country specific strategy would be necessary. So for example, I was glad to see that the Biden administration is reconsidering the support for the Saudi intervention in the Yemeni civil war. As you may know, going back to the Obama administration, there's been strong, I mean, really every US administration since FDR has supported the Saudi monarchy. But the Obama and Trump administrations, supported, and armed quite directly supported the Saudi intervention in Yemen, which is, substantially responsible for the humanitarian disaster in that country, including, a really serious malnutrition situation for much of the country's population, including its children. I think just a few years ago, the UN was calling it the largest humanitarian disaster in the world at that time. So I think, not doing harm is a good place to start. And I was happy to see the Biden administration, putting a halt to that, or at least I forget if it's actually come to a halt or they're reconsidering it. And I think, again, on a country by country basis, those kinds of moves would be, a kind of first do no harm approach would be helpful. I don't know that, these are not problems for the most part where, I think the U.S. learned, and I think Obama was right in as much as he concluded that, the lesson of the Iraq War, right, or one lesson of the Iraq War is that the United States can't go in, no country can go in and, solve the problems of another country, right, and create a democracy, right. So I don't think he was wrong about that. But that doesn't mean we can't do better, right? And so another place where I think the Obama administration failed, for example, was in the case of the Bahrain uprising, right? I think there, had the Obama administration exercised some of its, influence on the Saudi monarchy, right, not to intervene in Bahrain, right, there might have been a different outcome there and a kind of a renegotiation of the political order in that country. Of course, the U.S. Navy's Central Command is based in Bahrain. The Fifth Fleet is there, right? So it's not surprising that the U.S., didn't say anything. But again, these are issues that transcend kind of partisan orientation in the U.S., right? It's not just like a Trump administration thing or a Democratic administration thing. And I think, especially with the weight of the strategic weight that the relationship with Saudi Arabia carries in U.S. foreign policy, right? It can be very, very hard for the U.S. to play a really kind of pro-democracy role in the Middle East. I think the best it can do is not to kind of directly, is not to do harm. Louise, you had a question?
Yeah, so in 2016, I was in Jordan, and our guide told us that since the Arab Spring, their tourism had fallen by 80%, which is astounding when you consider that tourism is probably their biggest source of revenue ever at all. He said that what you can do for peace is get your friends to come here. So I did what I could. But now we have some very interesting machinations going on in Amman between King Abdullah, his half-brother Hamza. Can you maybe talk a little bit about Jordan's position in all of this vis-a-vis the Arab Spring and what's going on there now?
Yeah, I thought this might come up because it's been in the news this week, right? And I'm not sure we know what's going on in Jordan, to be honest. I mean, it's really interesting because, you know, the story up until now is that, you know, the Arab Spring had largely bypassed Jordan, right? And it was one of these kind of quote unquote stable monarchies, right? Where you didn't have, right. You know, I mean, there have been protest movements, you know, in Jordan since 2011, but certainly nothing on the order that, you know, would kind of destabilize the country. I think partly that reflects, you know, the sense of a tourist economy, partly, you know, the success of the Hashemite monarchy there in kind of creating a kind of cult of nationalism around, you know, the institution of the monarchy there. I mean, Jordan is a really different country from almost anywhere else in the region, right? In the way that it's kind of fashioned out of whole cloth, you know, after World War I. You know, it's not clear to me that this situation with the king's half brother represents, you know, some sort of in any way some sort of popular movement or organized dissent, rather than a sort of palace politics that you know, akin to what we, you know, sometimes have seen in Saudi Arabia. So I guess I would just plea that, you know, I think we probably need to wait and see what's going on in Jordan, because it doesn't seem very clear yet. But, you know, this issue of tourism, I think, has also been another interesting kind of structural factor in thinking about why protest movements have sometimes fizzled, or there has been this desire for, you know, just a return to order, right? We see this in Egypt as well, where there's been a real kind of sense of relief among many people since 2013. Might not be happy with the Sisi, everything that, you know, Sisi does, but at least, right, there isn't like chaos, right? And at least, you know, until COVID-19 happened, at least, you know, tourism was picking up again, which, you know, a lot of people really do depend on directly or indirectly. And at least, you know, the trash was being collected again, and, you know, there are infrastructural improvements, right? So I think there is, yeah, I know Ellen has spent time in Cairo recently, I think, and knows that the trash is being collected again, right? I think that, you know, so the fact that a lot of these countries do, you know, several of these countries do rely very heavily on tourism is a structural factor, you know, that kind of maybe mitigates a bit against, you know, the success of or the tolerance for a kind of long-term kind of revolutionary situation. That being said, I mean, revolution is rarely good for the economy anywhere, right? So I don't know that it being a tourist economy is, you know, is a particularly strong factor. But it is something I know that weighs on a lot of people's minds in the Middle East, that, you know, that there needs to be a kind of return to order for people to eat, right?
Right.
Question.
And there's also the pressure of the refugees from the Syrian civil war on the Jordanian economy, and that's another factor that seems like a wild card that it could explode really at any moment, and I'm kind of surprised that it hasn't yet.
Yeah, and in Jordan, and also in, you know, that's a major part of the situation in Lebanon as well, of course, and in a different way in Turkey. Yeah.
I have a question about Egypt. They are spending money right and left in Egypt. They're building new cities. They're building millions of roads. Where is all this money coming from? Everyone's really happy with Sisi because there's unemployment has gotten down to a very, very low number, like 2 or 3%, I think.
Yeah, I mean, my sense is that it's financed, right? I mean, it's not as though it's you know, reflects the ability of the government to generate, you know, revenue necessarily in a new way. Although, again, before the pandemic, there was some return to kind of, you know, the Egyptian economy was growing again, right, with the return of tourism. But, you know, a lot of it reflects the ability, I think, of the Egyptian government to borrow or to receive foreign aid, right, from the United States, from Saudi Arabia, right, from regional allies that are very happy to see the Sisi government in place there. You know, and as usual with the Egyptian economy, a lot of it is kind of opaque, right? Because, as you know, much of the country's industry is directly or indirectly overseen by the armed forces in ways that are not, disclosed.
I have a question that's kind of off topic, but it's about more about Iran, which is kind of the elephant in the region. I'll pose it as a historical question. Okay, so why the strong antipathy to an actual war now between Israel and Iran? Is it that historically Israel was a stand-in for the United States? Post the Iranian Revolution, is that the main impetus? What has gone on historically? I mean, I understand what you said since the Arab Spring, but it seems like it went back further than that. So, what were the historical reasons for that? And you can say you don't want to talk about it. It's okay too.
No, we can. We probably do need to wrap up, I guess, Paul. But maybe we could just talk about that and then wrap up.
Yep, that's good.
Right. It goes back, to some degree to the Iranian Revolution, right? And the hostility of the Iranian revolutionary regime, right, which comes to power in 1979. Right, that was comes out of a movement to overthrow the Shah, who was a very close ally, as you may recall, of the United States, right, in the Cold War, right, and had relations with Israel as well, right, and so the revolutionary regime, right, and the Islamic Republic, which comes out of 1979, right, comes to see the U.S. and the whole kind of U.S.-backed kind of order in the Cold War Middle East, right, as its antithesis, as its kind of implacable enemy. And this goes back to, the 1953 coup in Iran, right, when the U.S. and Britain deposed the Iranian prime minister, right, who was nationalizing, the British oil interests in that country. So there was there is this kind of genealogy, right, to the Iranian post-1979 Iran's hostility toward U.S. and U.S. allies in the Middle East, and of course also the Islamic, not just the Islamic character, but kind of more broadly the revolutionary character, right, of that regime, right, positioned it in solidarity with the Palestinian cause, right, as well. It's also, the Iranian regime, one of its kind of distinctive features is that it is, ideologically a movement that has sought to export itself, right, across the region, right. So it is not just, the ideology of it is that, it's not just, a movement that seeks to transform Iranian society, right? But which also has a vision for transforming the region and Islamic society more broadly. So there is this kind of aggressive kind of effort, from 1979 to kind of spread the Iranian Revolution, and to kind of use its ties, especially to create ties, especially with Shiite communities in other parts of the Middle East, including Lebanon, including Saudi Arabia, right, to kind of as a kind of tool of Iranian foreign policy. That's maybe a somewhat long-winded answer, but it does go back, to the Iranian Revolution itself, and the way that movement has always perceived itself to be in opposition to, or at least from its very early days, has perceived itself to be in opposition to the U.S. and its allies.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Dan. Appreciate you coming and talking with us and taking the time to get this together for us. We will.
Yeah, absolutely. It's nice to be with you all. Hi, Dawn. Nice to be with you all.
Hello, good to see you. Thank
Good
you.
to see you too. Yeah, nice to
Thank
see all
you.
of you. And please feel free to use that email if you have questions about the talk today, or also just about the history department at UW and the opportunities there.
Yeah, good luck with your semester and the upcoming book. We'll have to check back with you about that.
Thanks. Stay well.
Okay.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
And bye-bye.
Bye.